Why hello there, so this is my server laptop. It is a Lenovo ThinkPad T430. It is a quite nice laptop, and it's quite upgradable as well. It has an i5 3210M CPU, using Intel HD 4000 graphics. It also has 8GB of DDR3 laptop RAM at 1600 MHz. It is a quite decent little laptop, though there is one issue. The other day, I had to use it for my main computer for one day, and I was trying to play some games like BeamNG Drive and some other games like CSGO and Minecraft. Well, I've noticed something. The CPU tends to get a bit toasty, and that is an under-exaggeration. The CPU was reaching 102 degrees Celsius. Okay, that is hot for a CPU, okay? I know it is a laptop, but that still seems a bit hot. You know what I'm trying to say? So, for today's video, I decided to see how a thermal throttling 2-core 4-thread i5 from 2012 handles gaming in 2021. Then afterwards, I'm going to replace the thermal paste and clean out the fans and see how it games. And hopefully it is not actively trying to turn itself into an incinerator for nuclear waste while I game on it. Starting off, we're playing BeamNG Drive on the lowest possible settings at 900p, and it got an average of 13 frames per second with a 1% low of 12 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 5 frames per second. It wasn't that stuttery, but it was pretty unplayable because 13 frames per second is just not enough to play a game that requires somewhat fast reaction times. And the CPU maxed out around 80 degrees Celsius. The reason why the CPU is not getting any hotter in this situation is because the graphics card is the thing being maxed out, not the CPU. I'm not even sure if I can call it a graphics card because it's integrated graphics, but I will roll with graphics card anyway. Also, something that did not help with the CPU temperature the other day when it was reaching 102 degrees Celsius was I had the lid closed on the laptop because I was using it as a desktop sort of. If it was open, it might have ran 1 to 2 degrees cooler. Next up, I lowered the resolution from 900p down to a 480p or 640 by 480, and it got an average of 35 frames per second with a 1% low of 27 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 16 frames per second. And the game ran quite well with minimal stutters, though the problem here is it looks like you went over and rubbed Vaseline on the monitor. Then you proceeded to go over and blowtorch the monitor as well to make it extra hard to see. At least that's what it feels like when you're playing this game, because a lamppost is like 1 pixel and you can't really see it, and all of a sudden you wrap your car around a lamppost because you didn't see it. The next game up on our list is CSGO on the lowest settings at 900p. It got an average of 39 frames per second with a 1% low of 16 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 10 frames per second. The game was somewhat playable, but for a first-person shooter like CSGO, I wouldn't recommend 39 frames per second with dips into the 20s quite often, but it was playable for a casual player, or just your standard CSGO noob like me, since this is only my second time playing this game. And the CPU was working quite hard. It got over 90 degrees Celsius playing at 900p. Then I dropped the resolution down to 720p, and it got an average of 49 frames per second with a 1% low of 18 and a 0.1% low of 11 frames per second. This wasn't the absolute best experience, but it certainly was playable. And during this, the CPU was hovering around 92 to 94 degrees Celsius. And dropping the resolution even more to 600p helped even more. It was getting an average of 89 frames per second average with a 1% low of 29 and a 0.1% low of 5 frames per second. The 0.1% low of 5 frames per second was from loading in a map. And again, the CPU is hovering around 92 to 95 degrees Celsius. Dropping the resolution even more to 480p did not really help at all, because it is now the CPU holding the graphics chip back. It got an average of 85 frames per second, which is 4 frames per second average less than at 600p, with a 1% low of 32, which is a little bit higher than 600p, and a 0.1% low of 7 frames per second, which is a little bit faster than 600p as well. And on 480 480p, it reached 96 degrees Celsius. And on 480p and 600p, the game ran really well, especially if you want a 60 plus frame per second experience most of the time. So if you are a competitive player, this would actually work for you, at least if you consider 60 frames per second good, though there is a quite large downside of playing at such a low resolution. You cannot easily see the players, and you'll easily get sniped, and also you can't really tell which team what player is on, without having to walk up to them to see. So that is definitely a quite big downside that makes the game a bit harder. And if you choose to play at 480p, you're pretty much out of luck, though there is one solution I found to winning a game, or at least getting closer to winning a game, and that is basically spin in a circle and shoot everything you see. That isn't a very good solution, but you know, it is a solution nonetheless. Now, switching over to Minecraft Java, on the lowest possible settings, 900p, at 8 chunks render distance, it got an average of 67 frames per second, with a 1% low of 12 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 5 frames per second, and the game is quite playable. The CPU though did get up to 95 degrees Celsius here. I did try out some shaders, and the shaders got 0 frames per second, or I should just say NA frames per second. The reason why is I tried the complementary shaders, and when I loaded up any world or server, it just crashed the game repeatedly. Now, moving over to Roblox. I decided to use a Roblox FPS unlocker, and I decided to play Roblox Arsenal. I was playing on the lowest settings at 900p. It got an average of 57 frames per second with a 1% low of 28 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 19 frames per second, and the CPU was hovering around 95 degrees Celsius the entire time. The game was quite playable and had pretty much no issues. It did stutter at times, but that wasn't that big of a deal. The last thing I decided to do before cleaning out the fans and replacing the thermal paste is do one run of Cinebench R23. It got a score of 1347 and maxed out at 88 degrees Celsius. And replacing the thermal paste was quite easy. There was only one problem I came across when disassembling the laptop, and that was completely avoidable, but I just made a derp. So I didn't remove a screw for the keyboard, and I was trying to take the keyboard off, and I decided to take the laptop and put it sideways, and then take the screw out like that, and I forgot the fact that the keyboard is held on by a small little wire, and it can just fall right out, which it precisely did, and I thought I broke the wire, but it didn't break, which is nice. And also, the fan never really span up that high, so I decided I should go over and unplug it and plug it back in as well, just for good measure. And that seems to have done something, because the fans used to max out around 2000 RPM, and now it maxes out at 4075 RPM, which is a lot faster than 2000 RPM. And the difference between the performance when it had old thermal paste and the new thermal paste is so huge, you can see it from space without a microscope. You fell for that, right? Right? Anybody? Hello? No? Aw. Okay, so the actual difference is negligible. So in most games it actually performed worse with it running cooler than it did when it was running hotter, though for some reason CSGO at 720p performed a lot better when it was running cool. So 49 frames per second average at 720p was the average before, and now it gets 60 frames per second at 720p. Though 600p and 480p are pretty much unchanged, it actually performs slightly worse in the cooled version than it did when it was running super hot. And also it runs around 5 to 6 degrees Celsius cooler on every single game now versus before, though it does still get quite toasty. It gets up to around 92 Celsius. And if you're curious about the exact figure difference, here is a spreadsheet I made showing the difference between hot and cold. Well, okay, cold with an asterisk. It's not cold, but it's slightly cooler. Also, the ambient temperature in the room for all of these tests before and after the cooling change was around 30 degrees Celsius, which is warmer than most people's rooms. Though, the temperature of the room does not appear to affect the temperature of the CPU that much. For example, the other day when the laptop was at 102 degrees Celsius, my room was only 18 degrees Celsius, though it was running in desktop mode, meaning the screen was closed and I had a monitor plugged in with VGA, and 18 degrees degrees Celsius is significantly cooler than 30 degrees Celsius. And going on to the last test, we are checking out Cinebench R23 again. So, as a recap, in the last test, it got 1347 at 88 degrees Celsius. This time it got 1363 at 84 degrees Celsius. So the maximum temperature dropped by 4 degrees, and also the point went up by 16. It is not that big of an increase, but it is an increase nonetheless. Though it is in the margin of error, where there could have been like something going on in the background of Windows that might have gave it that extra 16 points. So, the moral of the story is this. Well, actually, I can't really think of one. I've thought of it now for 3 days. I guess, basically, if your laptop's running at 100 Celsius, you might as well go over and fix the thermal paste on it to expand its lifetime. If it's not thermal throttling, you aren't really going to gain any performance, but if it's running at 100 degrees Celsius, that is just too hot. You're probably going to start damaging things at that temperature. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like. If you disliked the video, make sure to leave it a dislike. If you are new and want to see more videos like this, I recommend subscribing. I will catch you again in the next video. See ya!